There is a piece of evidence sitting in a laboratory right now that could solve everything. It could tell us who walked into Nancy Guthrie's home. It could tell us who took her. It could end the search that has gripped an entire country for over 2 months. But that evidence, the DNA, is locked inside a problem that even the world's leading scientists are scrambling to solve. And tonight, Brian Entin is going to take you inside that problem, every layer of it. Because if you've been following this case and wondering why, after 68 days, there's still no arrest, still no answer, still no Nancy, this is the episode that will explain it all. Buckle in, this one goes deep. Picture Tucson, Arizona, a quiet neighborhood, a home that belongs to one of the most recognizable families in American media. Nancy Guthrie, sister of NBC's Savannah Guthrie, vanishes, not in a parking lot, not on a hiking trail, from inside her own home. And whoever took her was not careless. This was not a crime of impulse. Evidence suggests the suspect was inside that house for somewhere between 40 and 42 minutes. He came prepared. He came equipped. He came with gloves. But here is what investigators found when they processed that scene. DNA that did not belong to Nancy Guthrie. DNA that did not belong to anyone in her family. DNA that did not match a single person in her known inner circle. In a case with almost no answers, that was something. That was a thread. And if investigators could pull it, if they could unravel it, it could lead them straight to the person responsible. But pulling that thread has turned out to be one of the most technically complex challenges in modern forensic science. Because the DNA isn't clean. The DNA is mixed. And that changes everything. Most people hear mixed DNA and picture something they've seen on a crime drama. A scientist in a lab coat, a computer screen, a few keystrokes, and suddenly a name, a face, a match. The reality is almost nothing like that. When forensic scientists collect DNA from a crime scene, especially from a surface that multiple people have touched, breathed near, or been close to, what they often end up with is not one person's genetic code. It's several people's genetic code, all tangled together, layered on top of each other, overlapping in ways that make it extraordinarily difficult to determine where one person's DNA ends and another's begins. That process of separating them out, of pulling one individual's profile from the mess, is called deconvolution. And in the Nancy Guthrie case, that is the wall investigators are currently staring at. Brian Entin spoke with CeCe Moore, one of the most respected forensic genetic genealogists in the country, to understand exactly what's happening. And the first thing she said stopped everything cold. She believes there's a company, possibly more than one, that had been quietly developing brand new deconvolution software that wasn't supposed to be released until next year. But because of this case, because of how high profile it is, because the sheriff himself made comments suggesting something was being rushed, CeCe believes that timeline may have been moved up. Think about that. A technology that was months away from completion may be getting accelerated specifically because of Nancy Guthrie. Because the pressure of this case, the eyes of the nation, the weight of a missing woman, is pushing science forward faster than it was ever supposed to move. That is extraordinary, and it speaks to the gravity of what investigators are dealing with. But here is where it gets even more complicated, because not all DNA testing is created equal. For decades, forensic labs used a type of DNA testing called STR, short tandem repeat analysis. It's the method most people associate with crime labs. It's reliable, it's well understood, and over years and years of work, scientists have developed solid, sophisticated software to handle mixed DNA samples using this method. But starting around 2018, the field began shifting to a newer, more powerful method, SNP testing, single nucleotide polymorphism analysis.
SNP testing reads roughly 700,000 genetic markers across the entire genome. It is dramatically more detailed. It can pick up the faintest trace of DNA, DNA from a hair shaft, DNA from a doorknob, DNA from the tiniest fragment left behind at a scene. But SNP testing is newer, and the tools built to handle mixed DNA using STR don't work the same way with SNP. The deconvolution software for this newer method is still being developed. It is years behind where the STR tools are. So here is the situation in the Nancy Guthrie case, as best can be understood from the outside. Investigators likely have DNA. They believe it belongs to the perpetrator or perpetrators. But when they look at it, when they try to isolate it, it is tangled up with other genetic material in a way that the current technology is struggling to untangle. And the software that might be able to do it doesn't fully exist yet. That is where things stand on day 68. Not for lack of effort, not for lack of resources, but because science has limits. And right now, those limits are being pushed harder than they ever have been before. Here is something that gets overlooked in the coverage of this case. The suspect who entered Nancy Guthrie's home appears, based on surveillance footage, to have been holding a tactical flashlight in his mouth, a bite light. The kind of compact, hands-free light source used by people who need their hands free for other tasks. CeCe Moore focused on this detail, and her analysis is striking. Anyone who has used one of those lights knows what happens. Saliva, a significant amount of it. The act of holding something in your mouth for an extended period, moving around, exerting effort, potentially leaning down, produces a steady stream of biological material.
CeCe believes that if the suspect leaned over to disable a camera, if he crouched down, if he moved through that home for 40 minutes with that light in his teeth, he was leaving DNA behind with almost every movement. There is also the question of commands. If at any point the suspect needed to speak, to give an instruction, to communicate with someone, he would have had to remove that light from his mouth, and the moment he did, his hands, even through gloves, would have had immediate direct contact with his saliva. One touch after that to any surface in that house, one brush against a wall, one contact with a door frame, and his DNA is there. CeCe Moore is not speculating wildly. She is working from an understanding of how DNA behaves, how it transfers, how it lingers, how it endures, and her conclusion is firm. That DNA is in that house. The question is whether it has been found yet, and whether, once found, it can be separated from everything else it's mixed with. The crime scene has been released. Family members have been inside. Legal teams, moving crews, people with no forensic training have walked through those rooms. Most people would assume that means it's too late, that anything left behind has been contaminated, that the window has closed. CeCe Moore disagrees strongly. Here's her argument. Every person who has entered that home since the scene was released is a known person. Their identities are documented. Their DNA can be collected for elimination. They can be ruled out. And DNA does not disappear quickly. This is not evidence that degrades in weeks. CeCe has personally worked cases, cold cases, where viable DNA was detected decades after the crime. Decades. The genetic material was still there, still readable, still useful. So her position is clear. If investigators do not yet have a clean, workable DNA profile from the Nancy Guthrie scene, if the mixed sample is all they have and it's resisting deconvolution, then going back to that house is not a desperate move. It is a logical one, a necessary one. 42 minutes inside a home, a man who, by all indications, was physically active, using a bite light, moving through multiple rooms, the bedroom, the living room, the back door, the front entrance. He was everywhere, and he left something behind. Maybe it's already been collected and is sitting in a processing queue right now. Maybe it hasn't been found yet. But CeCe's message to anyone who will listen is the same. Don't stop looking. There is another possibility that CeCe raised, and it reframes how this investigation might unfold. What if the answer isn't in Nancy's house at all? What if the most important crime scene is somewhere none of us have looked yet? If Nancy was transported from her home, and all evidence suggests she was, then there was a vehicle involved. There may have been a location where she was held, a building, a room, a space that has not yet been identified, processed, or searched. CeCe pointed to a case in Australia, a grandfather kidnapped in what appeared to be a case of mistaken identity that unfolded around the same time as Nancy's disappearance. That case broke open not at the original abduction site, but at a second location, a place where the victim had been held, a place the perpetrator thought no one would ever look. That second crime scene gave investigators everything they needed. The same could happen here. If a location is ever identified where Nancy was taken after her home, and law enforcement clearly continues to search for exactly that, it represents a completely fresh opportunity, untampered, uncontaminated by the activity that followed the release of the Guthrie residence. In that space, there may be DNA that is clean, DNA that is singular, DNA that tells the story completely. And if that's where this case breaks, if that's the moment investigators finally get what they need, it will not feel like luck. It will feel like the inevitable result of people who refused to stop looking. Science is full of things that were once declared impossible. For years, for decades, forensic scientists operated under a firm belief. If a hair found at a crime scene did not have a root attached, if it was just the shaft, broken off, no follicle, then it was essentially useless for DNA identification. You might get mitochondrial DNA from it, which tells you something very limited about maternal lineage, but the autosomal DNA needed to identify a specific individual? Forget it. Scientists said it couldn't be done. Then Dr. Ed Green walked into his lab at UC Santa Cruz and did it anyway. What Dr. Green and his team discovered is that autosomal DNA, the precise genetic code needed for identification, doesn't disappear from a hair shaft. It's there, hidden, small, degraded, but there. And they developed a technique to extract it, to read it, to build from it a SNP profile powerful enough to upload to genealogy databases and potentially identify a suspect. CeCe Moore has used this technique personally. She has helped solve cases, real cases, cases with real families waiting for answers, where a rootless hair was the only physical evidence in existence. No blood, no fingerprints, no fibers, just a broken strand of hair. And it was enough. This is what makes the Nancy Guthrie case so important, beyond the family, beyond the media attention, beyond the tragedy of a woman missing. It is pushing the absolute frontier of what forensic science can do. The tools being rushed to completion, the techniques being applied, the experts being consulted. Every advancement made in the pursuit of Nancy Guthrie will save lives long after this case is resolved. It will give investigators new weapons for the next case and the one after that. That doesn't ease the pain of 68 days without answers, but it matters. Here is the number that changes everything. 54 million. That is how many people in the United States have taken a consumer DNA test through companies like Ancestry, 23andMe, and similar services. 54 million people who have voluntarily submitted their genetic code to a private database. If law enforcement could compare an unknown suspect's DNA profile against those 54 million samples, if investigators could simply ask the question, does this DNA belong to anyone in your system or anyone related to them, CeCe Moore believes cases would be solved multiple times per day, not per week, per day. But they cannot do that. Ancestry does not share its database with law enforcement. 23andMe does not share its database with law enforcement. These companies release transparency reports, documents showing exactly what information they have and haven't provided to authorities. And so far, the genetic databases remain closed, completely. Instead, investigators working with forensic genetic genealogy are limited to 3 much smaller opt-in databases: GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and the DNA Justice database, which CeCe herself helped create. Together, those databases contain fewer than 2 million profiles. 2 million versus 54 million. That is the gap. That is why cases that should take days sometimes take years. That is why a technology that could solve the Nancy Guthrie case tomorrow is sitting behind a wall of corporate policy and privacy law. Now, and this is important, there is a significant misconception about what law enforcement access to those databases would actually mean. They would not be reading your DNA. They would not be seeing your genetic profile. They would not be learning anything about your health, your ancestry, your predispositions. What they would be doing is asking the database a single question: does this unknown DNA share any genetic material with anyone in your system? And the database would respond with percentages. This person shares 1% of their DNA with the unknown sample. This person shares 3%. This person is likely a second cousin. That's it. No names, no profiles, no invasion of anyone's health information. Just a list of potential relatives, most of them very distant, that investigators could then follow as leads. In most cases, the average person would never know they were even a match. But those companies have held firm. They believe, and they are not entirely wrong to believe, that their customers trusted them with sensitive information, and opening that information to law enforcement, even in a limited way, is a line they are not yet willing to cross. CeCe Moore believes Nancy Guthrie's case could be the one that changes that. There is a dimension to this case that exists in almost no other missing persons investigation in history. The sister of the missing woman is one of the most recognizable journalists in America. Savannah Guthrie has access, she has relationships, she has a platform that reaches millions, and she has a personal stake in this outcome that no amount of professional distance could ever erase. CeCe Moore has noted, carefully and specifically, that if investigators develop a clean SNP profile from the Nancy Guthrie crime scene and it fails to produce a match in the available databases, there may come a moment when someone needs to make a direct, personal appeal to the executives of these large DNA companies. Not a legal argument, not a subpoena, a human one. The public sentiment surrounding Nancy Guthrie is unlike almost anything seen in a missing persons case. The support is massive, emotional, and widespread. A 2024 study that CeCe was involved in, conducted through Baylor University, found that 91% of Americans support the use of investigative genetic genealogy to catch violent criminals. And yet the companies holding the most useful databases continue to keep them closed. CeCe believes that if this case reaches the point where a DNA profile exists and the databases are the final obstacle, the pressure that comes from Savannah Guthrie, from the public, from the sheer visibility of this tragedy, may be enough to force a conversation that has never been successfully forced before. Whether that conversation leads to a warrant, a court order, or a voluntary decision by those companies to cooperate, it would be historic, and it would permanently change how these cases are solved in America. About 2 miles from Nancy Guthrie's home, investigators found a glove. It was processed for DNA. A profile was extracted, and relatively quickly for forensic standards, that person was identified and eliminated as a suspect. CeCe Moore believes that identification almost certainly happened through investigative genetic genealogy. The speed of it, the method, the circumstances,
All of it points to genealogical databases being used to trace the glove's DNA to a known individual who was then cleared. Why does this matter? Because it demonstrates what is possible when the DNA is clean, when there's no mixture to untangle, when the sample is workable, when the profile can be uploaded to a database and compared. The process moves quickly. A person is found. A lead is either confirmed or eliminated. The investigation advances. That is the version of events investigators want with the DNA inside Nancy's home. That is the outcome they are working toward. And the contrast between how fast the glove resolved versus how long the interior DNA has remained unresolved tells its own story about what investigators are likely dealing with. A mixture, a complicated one that has so far resisted every attempt to separate it cleanly.
But CeCe Moore's clear. That does not mean it cannot be separated. It means it hasn't been, yet. Somewhere in a laboratory or a development facility, a piece of equipment is being built that does not yet exist in any crime lab in America. A machine specifically designed to aid in deconvolution at the point of DNA processing, not after the fact when bioinformatics scientists are staring at a mixed profile trying to tease it apart with software, but at the very beginning of the analysis. A machine that would help separate the DNA before it even becomes a problem. CeCe Moore mentioned this technology carefully. She is not certain of its details. She cannot confirm its timeline, but she has heard enough to know it is coming. And she suspects, given the visibility of the Nancy Guthrie case, that the people building it are very aware of how much the world needs it right now. The estimated timeline is next year. That feels like a long time. It is a long time for a family waiting for answers. It is a long time for a country waiting for Nancy to be found. But consider this. The science of investigative genetic genealogy itself was considered impossible not that long ago. Experts laughed at the idea. They shook their heads. They explained patiently all the reasons it would never work. And then CeCe Moore and a small group of scientists built it anyway. Rootless hair was declared useless, a dead end, a waste of time. And then Dr. Ed Green found a way. The history of this field is a history of people being told no and refusing to accept it. So when someone says the deconvolution machine won't be ready until next year, take that with a grain of salt. Because under enough pressure, under enough urgency, under the weight of a case that the entire country is watching, timelines have a way of collapsing. Here is something worth sitting with. Even if a person has never taken a DNA test, has never swabbed a cheek, never mailed a kit, never created an account with Ancestry or 23andMe or any other service, that person may not be as genetically private as they believe. Because DNA is shared. If a sibling has tested, the profile in that database contains half of the untested person's genetic material. If a first cousin has tested, a quarter. If multiple relatives across different branches of the family tree have tested, the cumulative overlap paints a detailed picture. CeCe Moore put it plainly, Pandora is out of the box. The genetic databases have been built, tens of millions of people have opted in, and as a result, the vast majority of people in the United States are now identifiable through genetic genealogy, regardless of whether they personally ever participated. That is a remarkable statement, and it raises real questions about privacy, consent, and what it means to share information that belongs, in part, to people who never agreed to share it. But here is CeCe's counterpoint, and it is a compelling one. The companies that pose the greatest threat to personal privacy are not the genetic genealogy databases. They are the people search aggregators, the data brokers, the social media platforms, the services that compile names, addresses, family relationships, behavioral patterns, purchasing histories, and sell that information to anyone willing to pay. That data is already out there, vast quantities of it, and most people don't think twice about it. The conversation about genetic privacy is important, but it should be proportionate. And right now, in a country where 91% of people support using this technology to catch violent criminals, the balance of that conversation may be tilting. Canada, by contrast, has strict privacy laws that make it extremely difficult for forensic genealogists to identify living people. When working cases across the border, investigators can often get as far as grandparents, and then they hit a wall. Law enforcement has to take it from there. That difference is not abstract. It is the difference between a case that gets solved and a case that goes cold. There is a pattern in this field that comes up again and again in conversations with people like CeCe Moore. The breakthroughs, every single one of them, were made by people who were told it was impossible. Autosomal SNP DNA for genealogy? Impossible. Recombination rates too fast, information lost too quickly every generation. Scientists explained, in detailed technical terms, exactly why it would never work. And CeCe Moore and her colleagues built it anyway. And now it is the foundation of modern forensic genetic genealogy. Rootless hair as a DNA source? Impossible. The useful DNA sits in the root. Without it, there is nothing to work with. Case closed. Dr. Ed Green and his team at UC Santa Cruz proved otherwise. And now investigators are solving cases with nothing but a broken strand of hair. Deconvolution of complex SNP mixtures, currently mostly unsolved. The tools don't yet exist to do it reliably. The field is years behind where it needs to be. But somewhere, right now, there are scientists working on it, not because they've been told it's the next logical step, but because it matters, because there are families waiting, because there is a woman named Nancy Guthrie who has been missing for 68 days in a country that refuses to let her name fade. Those are the people who will solve this, not because they were handed the answer, but because they will not stop until they find it. The investigation is active. That is not a platitude. CeCe Moore is emphatic on this point. Behind the scenes, work is being done. Evidence is being processed. Swabs collected from Nancy's home may still be in testing queues. Algorithms are being run. Software is being tested. The silence from law enforcement is not absence. It is the nature of science. It moves at its own pace, on its own timeline, indifferent to the urgency of the people watching from the outside. But here is what the evidence suggests is happening. Somewhere, a lab is running that complex DNA mixture through every available technique. Somewhere, a bioinformatics scientist is looking at a profile and trying to tease apart what belongs to the perpetrator and what belongs to someone else. Somewhere, a company that was planning a software release for late next year is asking its engineers if there is any way to move faster. And somewhere, possibly still inside Nancy Guthrie's home, possibly in a location investigators have not yet identified, there is a piece of evidence that will change everything. A clean sample, a single contributor, an unambiguous profile. The moment that exists, the timeline compresses dramatically. GED match, family tree DNA, the DNA Justice Database, potentially, if it comes to that, ancestry itself, compelled by a warrant or moved by the magnitude of public pressure. And then, a name. This is not fantasy. This is how these cases have broken before. This is how Brian Kohberger was identified. This is how cold cases that sat in filing cabinets for 30 years have suddenly resolved. This is what happens when science, persistence, and the refusal to accept impossibility collide. The Nancy Guthrie case will not go quiet. The DNA will not stay tangled forever, and the people working to untangle it, the CeCe Moores, the Ed Greens, the unnamed scientists working through the night on algorithms and equipment and techniques that don't quite exist yet, they are not giving up. Day 70. But not day forever.